Ladies and gentlemen, avoidants don't usually realize what they're doing while they're doing it. And that is the first truth your viewer must understand if they want peace. They don't always wake up thinking, I'm going to hurt this person. Most of the time, what's happening is a nervous system response disguised as personality. In the moment, when intimacy rises, their body interprets closeness as pressure. When conflict rises, their body interprets emotions as danger. And the quickest way to reduce that pressure is distance. So they pull away, they shut down, they delay, they go vague, they disappear. And the tragic part is that this distance brings them immediate relief. That immediate relief is why they don't feel it in the moment. Relief can look exactly like indifference. Relief can look like moving on. Relief can look like being unbothered. Relief can look like them laughing, posting, staying busy, acting normal. While you are sitting at home with your chest tight, trying to make sense of why someone who claimed to care could treat you like you were disposable. But what you are seeing is not always the full emotional truth. What you are seeing is the avoidance nervous system exhaling after escaping intensity. And here is the key point: relief is temporary, but consequences are not. This is why they often realize after you're gone. Because while you are present, even if you are hurt, the connection still exists. Even if they go quiet, they still have access. Even if they delay, they still have the option. Even if they mistreat you, they can tell themselves, it's not that serious, because you're still there trying to talk, trying to fix, trying to understand. Your presence cushions the consequence. It keeps the story reversible. It allows them to believe they can come back later and reset things without fully facing what they did. So in the moment, they don't experience of loss. They experience a pause. And a pause doesn't create realization. A pause creates comfort. But when you're truly gone, something changes. When you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop reaching, stop being the emotional bridge, the pause becomes a verdict. The pause becomes permanence, and permanence forces the nervous system to process what it avoided. That is why your silence becomes so powerful. Not because it's a trick, but because it changes the reality from, I can return whenever, to, I might have lost them. This is the point where the avoidance mind starts doing what it refused to do earlier. It starts searching for meaning. It starts replaying. It starts connecting dots. It starts asking questions. And the reason those questions begin is because uncertainty has flipped sides. While you were present, you were the one uncertain. You were the one reading signs. You were the one wondering if you mattered. You were the one waiting. But now, when you're gone, the avoidant becomes the one uncertain. They no longer have the reassurance of your availability. They no longer have the comfort of your forgiveness being on standby. They no longer have evidence that the door is open. And this is the moment the audience needs to hear, because it explains why avoidants often reach out late. It's not always because love suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It's often because reality finally arrived. They can ignore your pain when it's in front of them if their defenses are strong enough, but they struggle to ignore your absence when it becomes consistent. Because absence is not an argument. Absence is not emotion. Absence is consequence. Now, what do they realize after you're gone? They realize the relationship was not held together by fate or chemistry. It was held together by your effort, your patience, your availability, your willingness to keep trying when they made it hard. They realized that when you stopped, the relationship stopped because they were not carrying it. They were benefiting from it. And that realization can be shocking because it exposes their own passivity. They also realize something else that hits harder than missing you. They realize they lost control of the connection. Avoidants often feel safest when they believe they control distance. They can be close on their terms and retreat on their terms. But when you leave quietly and fully, you take that control away. Now they cannot return when they want. They can only return if you allow it. And that shift, losing the power to manage the relationship through distance, creates a kind of panic that looks like sudden regret. This is why your silence feels like a verdict. A verdict is final. A verdict is not negotiable. A verdict is not something you argue with. And when an avoidant realizes your silence is not temporary, their defenses lose their comfort. The old strategy, withdraw and wait for you to come back, no longer works. So their mind starts replaying the very moments they dismissed, the conversations they avoided, the times you tried to communicate, the nights you cried, the moments you needed them. And now those moments are painful, because they are no longer happening in the present where they can escape them. They are happening in memory, where the only thing left is impact. So the first keynote is not just a hook, it's a truth that frees the viewer from self-blame. If the avoidant didn't realize in the moment, it wasn't because you were unworthy. It was because their coping style delays processing. But delayed processing doesn't mean no processing. When you're gone and the door is closed, the reality hits differently. Your silence becomes the point where denial ends and consequence begins. When you leave, the first downfall, realization for many avoidants isn't romantic. It's destabilizing. Because they don't just lose a person, they lose a form of stability they didn't recognize as stability while they had it. And that's what makes the aftermath so confusing for them. They thought letting you go would feel like freedom. They thought distance would feel like peace. They thought silence would be calm. But what they experience instead, after the initial relief wears off, is something they didn't plan for: being ungrounded. Here's why. Avoidants often build their life around appearing self-sufficient. They pride themselves on not needing anyone. They like to feel in control of their emotions, their time, their space. But beneath that identity is a nervous system that is quietly reliant on predictability and low emotional demand. Your presence, especially if you were a loving, patient, consistent partner, created a background safety they didn't have to work for. Even if they resisted your closeness, you were still a steady energy in their world. You were the one who smoothed over tension. You were the one who offered benefit of the doubt. You were the one who tried to reconnect after distance. You were the one who made emotional repair possible, even when they refused to participate fully. That is stability. Not the kind of stability that feels like fireworks, but the kind that holds life together. And the avoidant rarely acknowledges it while it's there, because stability feels ordinary. It doesn't create adrenaline. It doesn't create chase. It doesn't create the dramatic highs and lows that many people mistake for passion. Stability is quiet. It's the reliability of someone showing up. And quiet things are easy to undervalue, especially for someone who has learned to mistrust intimacy. So when you leave, the first thing that happens is often relief. Relief that the emotional pressure is gone. Relief that they don't have to respond to feelings. Relief that they don't have to be accountable. Relief that they can return to control. That relief can make them act cold, unfazed, even smug. And that is why you might feel invisible. Because you're grieving, and they're exhaling. But relief is not peace. Relief is what happens when you escape something that feels threatening. And if they cared, if you mattered, if you were a stabilizing presence, the relief doesn't last. Because reality has a way of revealing what you were providing once you stop providing it. That's when freedom starts to feel like being ungrounded. Ungrounded doesn't always look like sadness. It can look like restlessness, irritability, overworking, doom scrolling, picking fights with people, bouncing between distractions, dating quickly, staying busy. Not because they're thriving, but because stillness is when the missing becomes loud. Stillness is when the nervous system notices the gap. Stillness is when the mind starts looking for the person who used to soften life. And here's what they begin to realize: your love wasn't just affection. It was regulation. If you were the kind of person who reassured, who stayed calm, who tried to communicate, who held space, you became a stabilizer. You helped them return to baseline after stress. You helped them feel less alone, even if they never admitted they were lonely. You helped them feel seen without forcing them to face too much at once. Your presence created a sense of groundedness they could lean on, and because it was always there, they didn't notice how much they leaned. This is why, after you're gone, they can start feeling a strange emptiness that doesn't match their expectations. They expected freedom to feel light. Instead, it feels hollow. They expected distance to feel safe. Instead, it feels lonely. They expected space to feel empowering. Instead, it feels like something is missing that they can't replace with new people or new stimulation. And this is where the downfall begins, because it breaks their narrative. Their narrative might have been, I don't need anyone. Relationships are suffocating. I'm happier alone. It's better this way. But once they feel ungrounded, they can't fully believe the story anymore. The story stops calming them. Now, this realization doesn't automatically make them mature. It doesn't automatically lead to an apology. In fact, many avoidants respond to this ungrounded feeling by trying to restore control. They might reach for distractions, rebound attention, or superficial connections, because those don't demand vulnerability. They might hover around you, watch your life, send a breadcrumb, test access. Not because they've changed, but because they want to regain the stabilizing feeling you provided without stepping into accountability. And that is the key lesson for the viewer. Being missed is not the same as being valued correctly. Being wanted again is not the same as being treated well. Someone can miss the stability you provided and still not be ready to show up with consistency. But the realization is still real: you are stability, and losing stability is disorienting. They might not describe it that way. They might not confess it. They might act like they're fine. But the inner experience often shows up as that ungrounded restlessness, the sense that freedom didn't deliver what they promised themselves it would. And once that realization begins, the rest of the downfall unfolds: the replay, the mirror, the access panic. And finally, the truth that distance didn't protect them, it cost them. They didn't lose you in one fight, one mistake, or one bad day. They lost you in a pattern, and that realization is where the downfall becomes painfully specific. Because a single fight can be dismissed. A single mistake can be rationalized. A bad day can be forgiven. But a pattern exposes character. A pattern exposes capacity. A pattern forces a person to confront not just what happened, but who they became while it was happening. In the beginning, avoidants often survive relationships by telling themselves comforting stories. We're fine. They're overreacting. This is too intense. I need space. They're asking for too much. These stories aren't always intentional lies. They're protective narratives designed to reduce guilt and lower anxiety. They allow the avoidant to keep distance without feeling like the villain. And as long as you're still present, those narratives can stay intact because your presence keeps the consequences blurry. If you're still texting, still trying, still explaining, the avoidant can interpret it as proof that the relationship isn't truly in danger. The door feels open. But when you're gone and you stay gone, the stories stop working. The mind begins to replay, not because they suddenly became wise, but because the nervous system is trying to process a loss it can no longer deny. And in that replay, the avoidant starts realizing something that hurts more than simple missing. You didn't leave impulsively. You left because you were worn down. This is why the replay is so brutal. It's not romantic highlights first. It's often the moments they avoided. The times you reached out and they delayed. The nights you were anxious and they went silent. The conversations you tried to have and they shut down. The times they promised something and then didn't follow through. The moments you asked for clarity and they stayed vague. The way they kept you in uncertainty and then acted surprised when uncertainty finally broke you. And the realization lands like a weight. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for basics: consistency, communication, effort, emotional presence, and they repeatedly refused, minimized, or postponed those basics until your nervous system couldn't take it anymore. A pattern is made of repetition, and repetition is what breaks people. One cold moment doesn't destroy a relationship. A series of cold moments does. One silent day can be forgiven. A lifestyle of silence becomes emotional neglect. One "I'm busy" can be understood. Months of busy becomes avoidance. One cancelled plan can be an accident. Constant cancellations become a message you are not a priority. So when they replay, they start seeing the slow erosion. They see how you tried to adjust, how you lowered your needs, how you became more careful with your words, how you started asking less, how you started apologizing for wanting normal things. They see how your energy changed over time, not in one dramatic explosion, but in a quiet dimming. You laughed less. You reached out less. You stopped sharing as much. You started protecting yourself. And this is one of the most haunting realizations for avoidance. You were leaving long before you left. You were leaving in spirit while still being physically present. You were detaching slowly. You were mourning while still trying. And when you finally disappeared, it wasn't sudden. It was the final step in a process they ignored. This is why the pattern realization feels like a downfall, because it means they can't hide behind the idea that you were impulsive or dramatic. If you left after a pattern, it means you left with evidence. It means you left with exhaustion. It means you left with clarity. And clarity is hard to argue with. Now, what do avoidants often do with that clarity? At first, many resist it. They look for a single moment to blame. They search for a trigger event, because a trigger event is easier to explain than a pattern. If it was one argument, they can tell themselves, "That's why." If it was one misunderstanding, they can tell themselves, "We could have fixed it." But patterns don't fit into one explanation. Patterns point to a deeper truth: they didn't show up consistently. And once they see that, the mind goes to the next painful place: regret mixed with shame. Regret says, "I lost something valuable." Shame says, "I did this." This shame is why avoidants sometimes don't apologize even when they feel it. Apology requires emotional exposure. It requires admitting failure. It requires facing the person you hurt and risking rejection. For avoidants, that level of vulnerability can feel unbearable. So they may hover instead of repair, test instead of confess, send breadcrumbs instead of accountability. But the pattern still remains. The pattern realization also changes how they see you. They start realizing you weren't weak. You were strong for lasting as long as you did. They realize you weren't needy. You were responsive to inconsistency. They realize you weren't too much. You were underloved. And that realization can be deeply unsettling, because it means the problem wasn't your personality. The problem was the relationship environment they created. This keynote matters because it tells the viewer something liberating: you didn't fail because you weren't lovable enough. You left because you were paying the emotional price of someone else's defenses. You were trying to build a life with someone who kept one foot out the door. And the moment you stopped participating, The pattern became visible to everyone, including the person who benefited from it. That's the downfall, not a dramatic collapse, but the slow, undeniable realization that they didn't lose you by accident. They lost you by repeating the same harm until your love finally reached its limit. Your silence becomes louder than your heartbreak, and that is one of the most devastating psychological shifts for an avoidant because it removes the last place they can hide. Heartbreak is emotional. Heartbreak is expressive. Heartbreak talks. It asks questions. It reaches, it explains. And as painful as heartbreak is for you, heartbreak can still be comfortable for an avoidant in a strange way, because heartbreak keeps you engaged in the dynamic. It tells them you still care. It tells them the connection is still alive. It tells them the door is still cracked, even if you're angry. Silence is different. Silence doesn't ask to be understood. Silence doesn't negotiate. Silence doesn't plead. Silence doesn't give them a scene to blame. Silence doesn't provide a reaction they can label too much. Silence is not an argument they can win. Silence is reality. This is why heartbreak can be dismissed, but consistent silence cannot. When you cry, an avoidant can tell themselves a story. They're emotional. They're trying to pressure me. They're dramatic. They'll calm down. When you send a long message, they can focus on your wording instead of their behavior. They can pick one sentence and use it as proof that you're unreasonable. They can avoid accountability by turning the conversation into a debate. And when you're reacting, they can retreat and still feel safe, because they assume you'll come back and try again. Your heartbreak gives them movement. It gives them space to delay. It gives them the option to disappear and return later. But when you go quiet and stay quiet, the story collapses. Where is the drama? Where is the pressure? Where is the proof that you're still attached? It's gone. And what remains is the simplest, clearest message a nervous system can receive. Access has changed. That's why your silence is louder. It isn't just absence of words, it's the presence of consequence. It communicates finality without insulting them. It communicates self-respect without begging them. It communicates that you reached a limit. And limits are terrifying to avoidance because limits create permanence. Limits remove the comforting illusion that everything is reversible. This is the moment the avoidant begins to experience the relationship differently. While you were breaking down emotionally, they could stay detached and tell themselves they were calm. But when you are silent, their calm has nothing to push against. Their calm becomes empty. The dynamic that once relied on you doing the emotional labor suddenly has no fuel. And that emptiness forces their mind to face a question they avoided. What if they are not coming back? Heartbreak can be interpreted as a phase. Silence that lasts becomes a verdict. A verdict is final. A verdict says a decision was made. A verdict says the door closed. A verdict removes negotiation. And this is why silence can haunt them more than any paragraph you could write. Not because silence is cruel, but because silence is clean. It doesn't give them an excuse. It doesn't give them a fight. It doesn't give them a way to feel superior. It simply stands there, like a closed door that won't argue. This is also why your silence often triggers hovering. They watch your stories, they like posts, they ask mutual friends, they send a casual, hey. Those aren't always signs of love, they're signs of uncertainty. They're attempts to test if the verdict is real, because the avoidant's nervous system wants reassurance that the door is still open. Your heartbreak used to provide that reassurance. Your silence does not. And here is what makes this stage so painful for them. They have to confront their impact without the distraction of your reaction. When you were emotional, they could blame your emotions. Now they can't. So their mind begins to replay. They start remembering the moments you tried to communicate. The times you were patient. The times you stayed loyal even when it hurt. The times you gave them chances. And the more they replay, the more they realize your silence wasn't sudden, it was earned. It was the result of you reaching your limit. This is why the silence becomes a mirror too. It reflects their behavior back to them in a way they can't twist. Your silence says, I tried. I waited. I communicated. And nothing changed. That statement, even without words, is powerful because it reframes the story. It's no longer, they left because they were emotional. It becomes, they left because I didn't show up. Now the viewer needs one crucial warning here, because this is where many people get pulled back into the loop. The moment your silence becomes loud enough, the avoidant may return with a wave of emotion. They may say the right things. They may sound shocked, regretful, scared. But your silence should not be broken by emotion alone, because emotion is not proof of capacity. Your silence should only be broken by consistent accountability, because silence as a verdict is only a verdict if you keep it a verdict. If you break it quickly, the avoidant learns a dangerous lesson. Your silence was just another phase, another protest, another reaction. They regain comfort. They regain control. The pattern restarts. But if you hold it with dignity, something powerful happens for you too. Your nervous system starts to calm. The constant checking stops. The cravings soften. The addiction to mixed signals begins to die. And that is the deeper reason silence is louder. It doesn't just speak to them. It speaks to you. It tells your own heart, I am done abandoning myself. So yes, heartbreak can be dismissed, but silence that lasts becomes a verdict. And that verdict is what changes everything, because it forces reality to replace fantasy. It forces the avoidant to face consequence. And it frees you from the exhausting job of trying to prove your value to someone who only understands it when you're gone. Access panic is what happens when an avoidant realizes they might not be able to return on their terms anymore. And it often shows up as hovering and testing rather than direct repair. This is where many people get confused, because the avoidant's behavior looks like interest, but it doesn't always mean growth. It means activation. It means their nervous system has noticed a shift. The door that used to be open by default is no longer guaranteed. To understand why this stage is so powerful, you have to understand what access really means in avoidant dynamics. Access isn't just the ability to message you. Access is the emotional privilege of reaching you and still being received warmly. It's the privilege of knowing that even after silence, you will respond. Even after inconsistency, you will explain. Even after withdrawal, you will soften. Many avoidants rely on that privilege quietly. They might act independent, but the truth is, your availability becomes a regulator. It keeps them from feeling abandoned. It keeps their guilt from fully landing. It keeps the relationship reversible. When you leave and your silence becomes steady, access changes. And when access changes, panic can rise, not always as visible distress, but as a compulsive need to check if the connection still exists. That's why the first signs of downfall often look small. A like on your post after weeks of silence. Watching your stories consistently. Showing up in your views. Asking mutual friends how you are. Sending a casual hey with no context. These are not random. They are the avoidance attempt to reduce uncertainty without risking vulnerability. Because vulnerability is the cost of real repair. If they come in directly and say, I'm sorry, they risk rejection, they risk shame, they risk admitting they were wrong, they risk being emotionally exposed. For an avoidant, that can feel like stepping into fire. So instead, they do something safer. They test the door. They offer a breadcrumb. They send a low-risk ping that allows them to measure your response. If you respond quickly and warmly, their anxiety drops. The door is still open. Access is restored. They feel relief. And this is the part that keeps the cycle alive. The avoidant doesn't always need to return fully to feel better. They just need confirmation that they still matter, that they still can reach you, that you still respond. That confirmation can calm their nervous system without requiring them to change their behavior. This is why breadcrumbs are so deceptive. They feel like a comeback, but they're often just a temperature check. And if you take the bait, what happens next is predictable. Once they regain access and the panic fades, the avoidant's old coping strategy returns. They become inconsistent again. They pull away again. They get vague again. Because the root issue, fear of intimacy and discomfort with accountability, was never addressed. The only thing that changed was their anxiety level in the moment. This stage is also where you can see the difference between someone who misses you and someone who values you. Someone who values you will be willing to pay the emotional price of repair. They'll be willing to have the hard conversation. They'll be willing to acknowledge the pattern. They'll be willing to rebuild slowly and respectfully. Someone who only misses access will try to restore the old dynamic without the hard work. They'll keep it casual. They'll avoid naming anything. They'll act like time alone fixed it. They'll want to slide back into your life without accountability. And this is where your standards become everything. If you want to protect your peace, you must treat hovering and testing as information, not invitation. You observe the behavior without rushing to interpret it as love. You notice whether they can hold a real conversation, whether they can take responsibility, whether they can be consistent over time. You watch what happens after you don't respond immediately. Do they step up with clarity, or do they disappear? Do they respect your boundary, or do they punish you with distance? Do they try to repair, or do they try to reset? Because access panic can make an avoidant look suddenly interested. But interest is not commitment. Interest is not maturity. Interest is not capacity. Interest can simply be anxiety in disguise. This is also why they often return sideways. They'll reach out with something unrelated. They'll ask a small question. They'll act like nothing happened. That's not always disrespect. It's avoidance of shame. If they admit the hurt, they have to face the fact that they caused it. If they admit the pattern, they have to face their role in it. So they approach lightly, hoping you'll reopen the door so they can avoid the deeper reckoning. But if you keep the door closed until there's accountability, you force truth. You force them to either rise into repair or reveal that they only wanted comfort. And that is the downfall moment. They realize they can't control the connection through distance anymore. They can't vanish and return without consequence. They can't keep you as an option. They have to face the price of access, consistency, clarity, and respect. If they can't pay that price, they will fade. If they can, they will show it. Either way, you win because you're no longer living in the gray zone. You're living in truth. The final downfall is when the coping strategy collapses and they realize avoidance gave them short comfort and long emptiness. This is the point where the story stops being about you and becomes about the life they built around escape. Because for a long time, avoidance feels like it works. It reduces pressure. It reduces emotional exposure. It prevents difficult conversations. It lets them feel in control. And in the short term, that can feel like peace. But it is not peace. It is numbness. It is relief. It is a temporary quiet achieved by postponing what must eventually be faced. And postponed pain doesn't disappear, it accumulates. When an avoidant loses someone who truly cared, the first stages can be full of denial, distraction, and testing. But if access doesn't return, if the door stays closed, if your silence remains consistent, they enter a stage where the old tools fail. They can't reset the bond with a breadcrumb. They can't reduce uncertainty with a casual message. They can't rely on your patience to soften consequences. And because their coping strategy depends on those tools working, the strategy begins to break under its own weight. This is when they start to realize something brutal. Their way of protecting themselves has been costing them everything they secretly want. Many avoidants underneath the armor still want love. They still want connection. They still want to feel chosen. They still want to feel safe with someone. But they have confused safety with distance. They have confused control with peace. They have confused independence with emotional isolation. So they keep choosing the same pattern. When closeness appears, they retreat. When accountability appears, they detach. When emotions rise, they disappear. And every time they choose that pattern, they experience relief. The nervous system relaxes, the pressure drops. They tell themselves, this is better. But what they don't see in the moment is that each retreat also trains their life toward loneliness. Avoidance is a debt. You borrow comfort in the present by pushing pain into the future. And eventually, the future arrives to collect. The collection shows up in quiet moments, in the feeling that nothing truly satisfies, in the repeated cycle of starting relationships and ending them the same way, in the emptiness after the thrill fades, in the way they can be surrounded by people and still feel alone, in the way attention feels good for a moment and then feels hollow, in the way they sabotage the very intimacy they claim they can't find. This is long emptiness, and it's not always dramatic, it's chronic. And losing you can become the moment they finally see the pattern's cost. They realize that they didn't just lose a relationship. They lost a chance at stability. They lost a person who would have built with them. They lost someone who would have stayed if there was consistency. And the harsh part is, they realize it wasn't because they were unlovable. It was because they kept choosing the easiest short-term comfort instead of the hard long-term growth. That realization creates a fork in the road, and this is where the downfall becomes either transformation or repetition. If they choose transformation, it starts with something most avoidants avoid: accountability without excuses. They face the discomfort of seeing themselves clearly. They acknowledge their patterns. They stop rewriting the story to make you the problem. They become willing to learn emotional skills, communication, reassurance, repair, staying present during conflict. They stop treating closeness as threat and start treating it as a practice. They get help if needed. They do the work that proves they want love more than they want control. If they choose repetition, they double down on the old coping strategy. They keep dating casually. They keep seeking novelty. They keep pulling away the moment it gets real. They keep telling themselves, just wasn't right, without ever confronting their role. They may look fine on the outside, but the emptiness grows, because the pattern never produces what they actually need, and deep down they know it. They may not admit it, but the body remembers. The mind remembers. The loss becomes a reference point. I had something real, and I couldn't hold it. Now here is what your audience needs to hear most, because this is where your viewers finally feel closure. You do not need to wait for their realization to complete your healing. Their coping strategy collapsing is not your project. Their lesson is not your responsibility. Their emptiness is not your burden. Your job is not to stay close enough to witness their downfall. Your job is to build a life where love is steady, respectful, and mutual. And this is why this keynote is the strongest ending. It returns power to the viewer. It tells them that whether the avoidant changes or not, the truth has been revealed. Avoidance doesn't create freedom. It creates distance, and distance eventually becomes loneliness. The avoidant may realize it late, but you don't have to live late. You can choose clarity now. You can choose consistency now. You can choose a relationship where you don't have to disappear to be valued. That is the real downfall, not their sadness, but the collapse of the illusion that pushing love away leads to peace. It doesn't. It leads to long emptiness. And the moment you stop chasing someone who chooses that emptiness, you stop sacrificing your life to prove you were worthy. You were worthy from the beginning.